Good afternoon, everyone. Hello. Happy Sunday. My name is Stephanie Parrish, and I am the Associate Director of Education and Public Programs here at the museum. And I'm stepping in today for Brian Farizo, who'd like to be here but is battling a flu bug. So I get the honors of doing the intro for my friend and colleague, Randy Gragg, who we are all here to talk about John Yeon and the exhibition Quest for Beauty, the architecture, landscape, and collections of John Yeon. So a lot of people, I think, have waited a long time for this day. My own introduction to John Yeon came in 2008 when I had just moved to Portland and I was just hired at the museum. And my colleague at the time, Tina Olson, who was head of education, came out of a meeting and she was glowing. She talked about this exhibition, this project about John Yeon that the museum was planning to be a part of. And it was a few years later when she left and we were having lunch and she was thinking about things that I should really be paying attention to. And she said, if that John Yeon show develops, you make sure you help that project happen because that is a really important exhibition. And it was really in 2013, when Randy was hired by the U of O to be the director of the Yeon Center, that this project had a champion, and that this project could really go forward at the museum. And it has been a true pleasure to work with Randy and Dawson Carr and Brian Farizo and Mary Beth Graybill and a whole team of people who have brought the exhibition together. But it's really Randy, I think, and the smarts, the will, the passion that he brought to this project that brings us here today. So, who is Randy Gragg? I will give you a very brief bio paragraph that he doesn't want me to share, but I'm going to anyway. Randy is a writer, an editor, a producer who has worked in the Pacific Northwest, since the mid-'80s. For the last 3.5 years, he's been the director of the Yeon Center of Architecture and the Landscape, and he is the guest curator for Quest for Beauty. In addition to the exhibition, we have 2 fabulous books that Randy was the editor for, and that is a true testament to his incredible energy, which I don't know where you get all that energy, Randy, but thank God you have it. And for 4 years, he served as editor-in-chief for Portland Monthly Magazine. For 17 years, he was the columnist on design, architecture, and urban issues at the Oregonian. He has curated many, many projects, produced many visual arts events, and we are very lucky to have Randy in this community. So please join me in welcoming Randy Gragg.
Well, thanks for that very generous introduction. This project is, in many ways, been kind of a 20-something year project for me. It really started with introduction to John Yeon by Richard Lewis Brown back in 1992. And ever since that time, I just feel like I keep discovering more facets to John Yeon's career and life and work and impact on the Pacific Northwest. So it's just a constant learning process, and I want to share a little bit with you what I've learned and hopefully some things that are not in the exhibits and in the books. So we'll get a little sort of the extra credit to John Yeon today. I do want to mention a couple of other things that weren't in the rotation that the University of Oregon and John Yeon Center is producing. This is Hunter Nowak, floating above the water. He'll be talking or playing on September 10th at the Shire. And then I also want to mention that there are, I think, 3 tickets left for a 5-house tour of John Yeon's work on June 24th. If you're interested in attending that, see me afterwards. I should have an auction or something for those last 2. It's very exclusive. So anyway, with that. The conventional history of John Yeon sort of begins with this photograph. This is the Watzek House, finished in 1937, now our only National Historic Landmark house. And this photograph by Walter Boychuk that became kind of a, almost like a baseball card and sort of modernism in the 40s. It's published all over the world and several times by the Museum of Modern Art. And this became this icon, not just of a sort of Northwest regional modernism, but also of an American modernism, a kind of response to the times. In many ways, the big takeaway for me with John Yeon of the last 20 years has been his impact in other areas. And so this is why this photograph is so large in the sculpture court. This is Chapman Point from Ecola State Park. So you're looking down towards Cannon Beach and Haystack Rock. And in 1932, this was threatened with development. Ecola State Park had just been established. And John Yeon learned that the possibility of this view corridor would be interrupted, as the story goes, by a dance hall on the point. I don't have a pointer here, but on the actual point there. And so he tried to convince the Oregon Parks Department, which was run kind of then by the Highway Department, to buy it, and he was unsuccessful. And I want you to keep in mind, he was 21 years old at this point. And when they wouldn't buy it, he cashed in an insurance policy and bought it himself. And so that view corridor, and he held it all of his life. It's now the actual point is the John Yeon Natural Area. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got there. It's probably, it's a little bit like a playing card for Oregon. You know, it's, if Watzek House was published all over the world, this is published too all over the world, and all of our tourists. It's probably the most photographed vista on the Oregon coast. But John Yeon's vision, you know, stretches from the scale of these kinds of vistas to, you know, to the cabriole curve of this Japanese altar table. And it's rather extraordinary that, you know, he could that these ideas, that this sense of movement in form could inform so many facets of his career. This is a door handle in the Watzek House. So his vision really, his design vision, really stretches a lot of different scales, hence the title of this talk. I think if there's a summation statement for John Yeon's architecture, it's probably here. I suppose my attitude towards building and the landscapes was and is that of a landscape painter imagining what would look good in his landscape painting. He was not so much an architect who built, he was one who composed. So, this is in a sense his self-statement of learning, architectural credo self-evolved. It's not quite so simple as that. He had a lot of influences, beginning most prominently with his father, who came out to Oregon in 1882 from a farm in Ontario, Canada. And he joined a timber crew driving a three-yoke oxen team. And he quickly mastered the engineering of what were called skidways. These were greased log ramps, basically, to move timber. And John Yeon, the elder, was a preternaturally talented road builder. And, you know, of course, in those days, in order to get the timber out, you had to build a road, and he was really good at it. And he eventually was able to make enough money to buy his own stands, and then he took up a more upstanding, in some ways, profession, real estate development. But he was pretty good at that, too. This is the Yeon Building, which is named for the elder Yeon. And it was completed in 1911. It's 15 stories. It's a beautiful terracotta building that still stands today. And interestingly enough, it was kind of considered, it was thought it was going to be a boondoggle. It was just too large for Portland at that time, and it opened fully leased. And actually stood as the city's tallest building for 15 years. These characters, they look so kind of, I don't know, like they could be members of the Trump administration or something now, but they aren't. They aren't. On the left, Simon Benson, Sam Hill, and of course Samuel Lancaster. And these guys were trying to get something called the Columbia River Gorge Highway built, but they were kind of in the ditch with it at the time. Lancaster was a brilliant road designer, but he was a terrible manager, and it wasn't getting built. And so they recruited John Yeon the elder to build the road. And he agreed to do it, taking only $1 a year, because he didn't want any of his decisions questioned. So he privately raised $50,000 to complete the excavation for the road. He lobbied the public tirelessly again to pass a $1.25 million construction bond. You can only imagine what that would translate to today. In part to do better paving, because he wanted to do the best paving possible. And he managed, and sometimes actually worked alongside, 2,200 men to build the road, and he did it in 2 years. The road would not have been built without John Yeon, the elder. John Yeon, the younger, was 5 years old on the dedication in 1916. So these are the characters that he's growing up around. So he remembered Sam Hill as wearing a cape and his long flowing hair, white hair like God. And he captivated John Yeon the Younger with this kind of large-scale romantic vision. And Benson actually bought Multnomah Falls and gave it to the city. It was started as a city park. So, and then Lancaster imported Italian stonemasons. This is the first paved highway in the Pacific Northwest, and this is the kind of attention to detail that these guys did. And as John the Elder put it, hit the future as hard as your money and brains will permit, otherwise you will be out of date tomorrow. So this is John Yeon's father. But he had another side to his upbringing. This is the family house up on Mock Crest, and he poured through gardening catalogs, flower catalogs with his mom. And he describes his first job as being a rose garden that he designed for his grandmother. And he would build little landscapes around this house and actually, fill up, excavate and fill things with a water hose. And so, he had this kind of, interest in the landscape, not surprisingly, at a very, very early age. There's our young man, handsome devil. His other big influence architecturally was Herman Brookman. And Brookman was imported to Portland by Lloyd Frank in 1923 to design Fir Acres, which was then by far and away the most prominent estate in Portland. There it is, another view. It's now the heart of Lewis and Clark campus. FYI, there's a Brookman drawing show that's opening today, actually, at the Jewish Museum that we kind of did in conjunction with this exhibition. And John talked about his Brookman's architecture as being my first exposure to the real thing. I liked its romantic nature, its inventive surprises of form and details, its use of crafts and unusual materials, its magical evocation of long ago and far away. Manuka was in Brookman's office when John was interning there in summers. He probably, and you can kind of see that large-scale romantic vision here as well, not the least of which was the view of the Columbia Gorge, where his father had worked. Also, Temple Beth Israel was in the office around that time. This is Brookman's most prominent work of architecture. And I think, often I think about a lot of John's work being, in a sense, like this, a kind of belvedere. There's always an overlook. And so there's a sort of DNA to Fir Acres that I think reoccurs a lot in John's work. The other important influence on him was Harry Wentz, who John took drawing classes here. Wentz was director of the museum school. And he's an interesting character. I hope someday somebody does a retrospective of him, because he's just this interesting character in Portland history. He had a lot of influence, but wasn't super prolific. Anyway, as John described it, I still see with senses beyond my own, but now inseparable from them, when revisiting the various types of landscapes he painted, from the rarefied atmosphere of mountain meadows to the heavy motion of the sea. This little cottage, which was actually built in 1916 for Wentz by A.E. Doyle, the architect, although it looks like nothing Doyle did before or after, so I can only imagine that Wentz had quite an impact on it. This is, if you were going to look for a Rosetta Stone for Northwest regionalism, this would be it. Both Pietro Beluschi and John Yeon spent a lot of time at this little cottage, and it was incredibly influential on both of their work. John talked about the sort of it was spruce, and it had this pearly luster inside like a seashell. And he talked about it being the first time he sort of recognized a kind of regional beauty in architecture. The first piece of architecture they really saw that meant something here for him. And he talked about Wentz's quiet taste, which I think is really an interesting phrase. This is, I guess, probably the another important influence on Yeon. He bought this painting when he was 23 years old. And he talked about Chinese art, and Chinese painting in particular, and a kind of affinity between it and the Columbia Gorge. But moreover, the attitude toward landscape among the Chinese was really important to John. As he put it, the Chinese accepted and rejoiced in their natural landscape on its own terms, and they sought identity with it. The people and the architecture appear in their most characteristic paintings are dwarfed and absorbed by the fantasy of nature. Gardens were a piece of the wilderness reduced to a scale that could be intimately cared for, loved, and possessed. And I think it's an interesting sort of almost thesis statement for John's attitude towards landscape. And there's our young man at age 20 in the spruce. So, John Yeon in his 20s. He wanted to be an architect from an early age, and during his early 20s did a number of unbuilt designs, which you can see in the exhibition. But in a sense, his first mark really comes with the purchase of Chapman Point, and also with this landscape. This is Neocani Mountain. There were trails along the mountain, and there was ambitions to build a highway on it. There'd even been a little bit of blasting for that highway. And the State Highway Department was able to get some federal funds to do a more major coastal highway. And the chief engineer at that point, R.H. Baldock, was a real straight line guy. You cut and you filled, and that was kind of the ethos of road building. And so they were planning to blow away a significant amount of the mountain in order to build a highway. So John Yeon, in his early 20s, mind you, proposed an alternative for this, obviously inspired by his father's work on the Columbia Gorge Highway, but also kind of visionary design. He built this model of it. It was actually exhibited here, and he promoted it in the press and whatnot. And R.H. Baldock and the highway director, Leslie Scott, were not so interested in what a 23-year-old had to say about their design. And so John actually went to Washington, D.C. to personally lobby the chief landscape architecture for the Federal Highway Department. And he succeeded in getting the highway changed. This is what was ultimately built, designed by Condi McCulloch. And he wrote a really great letter to young John Yeon in 1933 about his design. I have had the privilege of looking over your studies. The effect is beautifully spectacular, and the resulting finished product would be hard to beat. And so those curves, when you drive over Neocani Mountain, you can thank John Yeon in some part for those. As a result of that work, he was appointed to a whole bunch of different commissions, and he was a well-connected guy. He was the son of John Yeon, Sr. His address was the Yeon Building, so as he put it, he grew a mustache so he would look older. But he was ultimately appointed to the State Planning Board, to the Oregon Roadside Council, the Chamber of Commerce's Municipal Projects Committee, and the Portland Planning Commission. But as the chair, mind you, of the State Planning Board's Recreation Committee, John wrote a 1935 survey of potential parks across the state. And this is a map of the ones that ultimately became part of the Parks Department. I mean, it ranges from Tillamook Head to Devil's Punch Bowl to Cape Perpetua to Metolius Springs. I mean, it was across the board. His first built work was actually a garden. which I understand is actually, there's more of it than I imagined. I just met the owner of the house that this garden is at, and I've never been able to visit. I went looking for it once and found only a few remnants. But anyway, this is known as the King Street Garden. This was for John's mom. And it's a big break with gardening at the time. The great landscape designer and historian Wallace Huntington described it in Space, Style, and Structure as unlike any previous Northwest garden. It could be evaluated as an unlike any previous Northwest garden, the King Street Garden can be evaluated as an independent art form. The first instance where the artist's major concern was exploring an original landscape form. In Oregon, it was the beginning of contemporary landscape design. 24 years old. In his travels and these various commissions, particularly the Parks Commission, he bumped into this fellow. This is Aubrey Watson. And Watzek was, as you can tell, first citizen at one point. He was chair of many different important boards in the city. His wealth came from lumber, as John Yeon's did, but he was an investor. He had the Crossett Lumber Company. And his father, actually, it's interesting, his father was the original partner, and they were known for some of the first use of selective cutting in order to maintain perpetual operation. So he was kind of an interesting character, and he and John Yeon became very, very fast friends and hiked and skied together and climbed mountains. And they also played an important role in the establishment of the Olympic National Park. John wrote a treatise in American Forests that was a sort of rebuttal to those who were taking issue with the Olympic National Park. And it's interesting, he really breaks down, the primary argument against it was economic, and he really breaks the argument down in this treatise, aside from just some soaring rhetoric, some beautiful rhetoric about the landscape, but you can kind of tell there's some coaching probably from Aubrey Watson behind the scenes in it. And as a result, I mean, they were one of the few voices in the Northwest really pushing for the park. Ultimately, it did become a park. John testified at Congress. He also, there was a National Parks Commission, National Parks Convention that he gave testimony along with Ansel Adams at that time, who was lobbying for the Kings Canyon, the saving of Kings Canyon. So he was very influential in this time. Now, Watzek lived at the Arlington Club and was, as they said in the day, a confirmed bachelor. But when his father died, he wanted to build a place to take care of his mom. And so young John Yeon, his friend, went out and found a site and built a model. Watzek thought it was maybe a little avant-garde, a little expensive. He went and flirted with a couple of other architects, including Pietro Beluschi, and ultimately circled back to John Yeon, who did it in A.E. Doyle's office because he wasn't a licensed architect. There it is under construction, and there it is. So it's basically that model came to fruition. Of course, as I mentioned before, published widely, becomes this important icon. Elizabeth Gordon declared it one of the great houses in America. And this picture that became so important, John had some funny things to say about it. He talked about how he never really actually anticipated this view, much less the shadow line that was captured. Walter Boychuk, who took this photo, happened to be wandering by. It was not commissioned. And he's described it later, my reputation is based on a view which soon disappeared and by a fortuitous shadow which I never anticipated. It's kind of architecture in general in some ways, I think. But, you know, he was not without some connections. He had spent some time in New York. He had already met Philip Johnson, the curator of architecture at the Museum of Modern Art. He was running with some interesting characters during his travels in New York. For instance, Lincoln Kirsten, the writer and impresario, the founder of the New York City Ballet. Glenway Westcott, the poet, novelist, and essayist. like them in these photographs. John was photographed by George Platt Lynes, so he was in very, very good company. It was an elegant crowd. He was good friends with Alfred and Daisy Barr, Alfred being the founder of the Museum of Modern Art. In fact, when he came back from war, he actually stayed in the Barr's dining room for a while. Gives you a testament to the closeness of their friendship, but also the times. Now, you have to think about what else was going on in architecture at this time. If you were a young architect in your mid-20s, you might be looking at this. This is Villa Savoye, Le Corbusier's masterpiece of 1927. And, when John did the Watzek House, it was basically 5 years after this exhibition, nominally known as the International Style Exhibition, in which European modernism, this sort of different idea of building, was really brought to the American shores. And I'm going to pick on Corb, or do a little bit of a comparison. John described the international style as the house of cards syndrome. He wasn't really interested in the sort of open floor plans and the disconnect from the landscape. And so I want to kind of take you on a kind of comparative tour here. So Watzek House, relationship to the landscape, interior of Villa Savoye, interior of Watzek House, courtyard on the second floor of Villa Savoye, courtyard at the Watzek House. And these photographs, by the way, are by Ezra Stoller, the great architectural photographer of the mid-century. And of course, then there's falling water that's going on. It was finished the same year as the Watzek House, 1937. As John described it, when I first saw Wright's work, I took it as thrilling confirmation, not a prod. And Villa Marais, which I think there's a lot more affinity, at least conceptually. This is by Alvar Aalto, his masterpiece, also of 1937. So these are some of the ideas that are kind of floating around at that time. In a sense, in the Finnish context, it's almost as though Aalto kind of had to make his landscape, and the architecture sort of does that. There's another view of it. But I think with Yeon, the difference is quite interesting. The landscape historian Ann Winston Spurn has talked about Frank Lloyd Wright as the peculiarities of a local landscape held no interest to him. And so he was interested in the prairie, not a prairie. And Aalto had no landscape really to work with in the same sense that we have here. And so Yeon, by contrast, really designed to the specifics. This is a site plan for the Watzek House. John liked axes and terminal vistas, which were an anathema to the international style. These are the view corridors from the house that are articulated to Mount Hood, Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, the Willamette Valley. But then there's also this relationship to the intimate landscape. And so he's constantly, it's almost like a nature-culture kind of relationship that he sets up with this. And then even this landscape, which was I was dubbed the Alpine landscape, which was a little, he and Aubrey Watson would gather plants from their hikes and plant there. And it's a little bit almost as though one of the 3 volcanoes you could see from this property at the time kind of came into the landscape. And that's, basically that's a sort of, the borrowed landscape is really important in Chinese landscape and in Japanese landscape. But this idea within an American context was something totally unprecedented. There's another view of it. But then he was also interested in the details and what we now call repurposing or upcycling, trendy word. On the left we have a Japanese fishing float. On the right we have an acid battery casing that John turned into light fixtures. And then of course we have this wonderful detail of the handle. So many architects had big planning ideas during this period. This is the Radiant City, Corb's view of the future of what cities could be from 1924. Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City of 1928, almost kind of a response, American response to the Radiant City. But what John was interested in planning was the Columbia Gorge. During this period, this is the old Cascades. The Bonneville Dam was being planned and constructed. This is mid-30s. There it is under construction. And John was appointed to head a committee looking at the future of the scenic resources of the Columbia Gorge. It has a rather ungainly title, Report on the Problem of Conservation, Development, and Scenic and Recreational Resources, et cetera. And in it, it's quite an interesting document, because in it, John writes, "The gorge in itself is an industry paying substantial annual dividends as an exhibit of surpassing natural scenery, as long as its wild and magnificent scenery survives." And this report outlines a comprehensive program for new recreation facilities, watershed protections, game preserve, the recycling of river dredging spoils for road beds, the setting aside of 200-foot right-of-ways along future roads to serve as both kind of beauty screens, but also as habitat corridors. It's an incredibly visionary document, and likely is really the closest thing to the first environmental impact statement ever done in the Pacific Northwest. It's also, interestingly enough, scenario study, which is something you don't really see emerge in American planning until the 70s. So these are some illustrations showing what a roadside rest might look like if you just kind of built a road. And John wanted to create, and the committee wanted to create limited access freeways. So as you can see, there's one view, which would have been sort of messy, visible development, billboards and whatnot. And then this more scenic version, kind of tuck it behind the trees. Same with the highways. The cut and fill ethic was still very much alive. Baltic was actually still road engineer and wanting to do that. And John proposed curves in the highway, both for safety, but also from a picturesque standpoint. He was very self-deprecating about his own talents at times. In a letter he wrote from North Africa to the curator of architecture at MoMA, he talked about, but what I really can do, though, is make pots. I make excellent pots. If you ever have a terrace that needs some, I'm the one to make them for you. And in fact, he did make some really good pots. For any of you who have actually thrown a pot, these are substantial things for someone to kind of just do as one-offs. It's most impressive. So I'm going to talk a little bit about space. Let's see how my time is going here. So as John described it as penance for the cost overruns of the Watzek House, he and the builder, Bert Smith, went out and did a series of speculative houses. And these are really interesting houses. There's a wonderful model in the exhibit that shows the building system that John invented. This is the first use of exterior plywood, or plywood as an exterior material. It was actually marine plywood developed for the boating industry. But I want you to pay attention to how close the trees are. John would actually fence off the sites so that you could preserve as much of the natural landscape as possible. He created this venting system, passive ventilation. The glass is actually fixed, and the air circulates below. There's another view of it from the exterior. And these innovations were widely adopted. This became kind of a meme in contemporary architecture, to the point that the louvers were designed into houses without the actual ventilation. But I want to look at the detail. This is the mullion on, every little detail, wherever possible, he just injects some design. The roofing system was tongue and groove 2x6s, so it was trussless, which made it stronger, but also created a really elegant eave line. And this house was published in an architecture forum that was devoted to affordable housing. It was basically a very similar crisis to what we're facing today. The Great Recession, or Great Depression had just happened. There had been a lot of compression in the housing market, and there was a need for affordable housing. And John's designs clocked in at $3,280 for one of these houses. And that compares with $78,000 that was spent on the Watzek House. So in a sense, his mea culpa was successful. That's approximately 4% of what the Watzek House cost. Some of them were a little more customized. This is the Jorgensen house, and you see this just careful knitting of even this a very affordable house within the landscape. These are these beautiful Maynard Parker photos that are in the exhibition. You see just the care with which every move is made. That's what it looks more like today. And at the time, John painted the houses, because you had to paint the plywood, and he took the color from the leaves, one bluer than the leaves and the other yellower than the leaves. And so that's how he came up with the color scheme. This is the Viator house. This is the only house outside of Oregon that was built. He designed a number of houses for clients outside of Oregon, but this is the only one that actually got built. And it's extraordinary. It's built out of just off-the-shelf dimensional lumber. And his sense of color is even apparent here in the interior. And to give you a little more architectural theory, with this house, John began to develop a scheme towards approaching space. So this is the floor plan. And he called it the Pinwheel Scheme of kind of masses and voids. And so these are the masses: the bedroom areas, the kitchen, the view to the ocean, and to the intimate landscape. So essentially, these masses are surrounded, are connected together by glass, and that becomes the common areas of the houses. And then with the windows creating this relationship to the landscape near and far. Again, this kind of culture-nature relationship. John also had what he described an obsession with movement that affected the exterior compositions, namely the roofs. In the proportion of roof surfaces, there was movement from narrow to broad, low to high, and a beginning and a climax, which may have looked casual, but as he put it, believe me, it was not. To get an exterior with its movement imperatives to fit over an interior with its movement imperatives takes some doing. No wonder most modern architects stuck with flat roofs. John did one flat roof building, which is the Visitor Center down on the waterfront. This is what it looked like in its glory years, with this beautiful blue that came to be known as John Yeon blue. And you have to keep in mind, this building was built when Harbor Drive was still along the river. And so it's a very careful use of the pinwheel diagram, both in the abstract, but also to sort of screen views of the highway and the old Oregon Journal building that was next door. It was this hulking mass of concrete. Here's some wonderful interior views by the great architect, photographer Roger Sturdivant. And this is really the first building to actually address the river as a kind of subject. There's the floor plan. The river is low. These are the masses. The near views to a courtyard and adjacent landscape, and the views to the river. And then a wall to keep you from looking at the Oregon Journal building. There it is in situ. You can see the old highway adjacent to it. It's also, it was all native landscape in the original, and Wallace Huntington pointed out that it was the first public landscape to use local species as a primary strategy. It had a great life in publications as well. The Museum of Modern Art took it up in the 1950, built in the USA. There it is, occupying the final pages of that catalog. And this is the company it kept. Lever House, Pietro Beluschi's masterpiece, the Commonwealth Building, the Johnson Wax Laboratory Building, and Philip Johnson's Glass House, and Alvar Aalto's MIT dormitory. So if there's any thinking that it was hailed as an international style in wood, the visitor center, but John was only, he didn't really think of it that way. He was already kind of thinking about other styles in architecture, and his love of history, so beautifully exhibited in the Watzek House, came forth in something, in a style that he liked to call the palace style, sort of tongue-in-cheek. And he designed a number of palace-style houses, but only one was really built, which is the Shaw House of 1950. And you see this kind of Belvedere idea again with the curving terrace and the overlook. But then there's the interiors. Hardly what we would think of as high modernism of the time. There's a lot of John's objects he styled the photographs with. But then these extraordinary details like this curtain. It made the cover of House Beautiful and was described as a harbinger of the age of great architecture. We unfortunately weren't able to borrow or use the color pictures that exist by Maynard Parker of this house. So the only record of them I can show you is this magazine spread to give you just a sense of his use of color. You know, this ice blue and the hemlock that was on the ceilings that was bleached to a kind of pinkish hue. As John described it, the exterior was also blue with white cornice and moldings between the panels. The relaxing of the roof slope at the eaves suggests a Chinese pavilion as imagined from evidence on Chinese blue and white export porcelain. The house could be considered modular chinoiserie. And then even in the 60s, the Watzek House was still having a publication life. Here it is in a spread in House Beautiful, How Long Will Modern Last, paired with the Glass House. But John got kind of frustrated with clients. He obviously, as the exhibit details so beautifully, was a great collector. He had many relationships in the art world, and so he took to designing galleries. He also had designed many exhibitions and galleries here. The first permanent gallery that he designed was for the Crest collection, but his curation history with the Portland Art Museum dates back to the 1930s. He was hired to design 100 objects of Asian art from the Avery Brundage collection in San Francisco in 1960. And this became kind of one of the first so-called blockbuster exhibits. Thousands of people went to this, and it ultimately catalyzed public support for a $2.7 million bond to add a wing to the de Young Museum. And then John was invited to design the galleries in the de Young Museum. He also was a lifelong friend with Lawrence Sickman at the Nelson Atkins Museum, and he designed a number of galleries there as well. This is English Miniatures Gallery. Oops, we've got a Portland Art Museum. That's, some of you will probably remember the old Marjorie Hoffman Smith galleries. And this is back to the Nelson Atkins Museum, the Japanese screen galleries, which I believe are still in situ. John, his design thinking can also be found in ways that you might not even imagine that surround you every day. He was very early to the game of thinking about historic preservation, although he had a very different attitude than we have toward it today. In 1951, he organized a tour and produced a leaflet about the 1882 Knapp House, and was about to be demolished by the Archdiocese of Oregon. And so he produced this little brochure and described it as the bright event from the dreary period of Victorian architecture, which generally he regarded as being meaningless ornament over awkward proportions. But this was a masterpiece. He wasn't successful in saving the building, unfortunately. These are, some of you may have seen the book of Minor White photographs of this, and it was an incredible building. When Portland's only Greek Revival building was about to be torn down for a parking lot by First National Bank, John lobbied to try to save it and actually went to the governor, Tom McCall at that time, for both the building and to create a state tax program to incentivize preservation, which McCall took up. and actually got through the Oregon legislature. So thanks to John, that idea took hold. But the bank was unyielding, and so John wrote this amazing letter to Ada Louise Huxtable. He didn't know her. She was arguably the most powerful architecture critic who's ever put pen to paper. And she was very much in the early days of the preservation movement, and so John just cold wrote her. And she took up the cause and wrote a full-page screed about saving this building, and it was kind of incredible. Let's see if I can find it here. She talked about the cultural vandalism and the double whammy of a disaster, not just the demolition of this beautiful building, but of the erection of the monstrous new tower, which is, of course, the Charles Luckman Tower that stands today, the sort of rocket ship building we all know and love. It was then the tallest building and jutting into the view of Mount Hood. But as a result of this campaign, and actually the Oregonian republished the piece, but took out all the criticism of the bank. But the bank relented and ultimately sold the building, and it still stands. I think its most recent use is as flexible office space. If you go up into Maclay Park, you will see this wonderful entry that John designed, even designing the font. And you can see the cabriole idea even here in plan view. And if you're driving up Highway 99 sometime, and you'll notice this sort of double allée of sequoias, that's due to John Yeon. In 1934, he was lobbying for this allée along what was going to be then the superhighway between Portland and Oregon City. And he talked about creating a splendid avenue of monumental character. And in time, it would surpass the famous Sequoia Cryptomeria Avenue of Japan. Unfortunately, he did get a grant to plant a few of these trees, and they're still there, but it didn't go any further than that. But a place where this idea of the allée became important was in a waterfront park. When the park was first being designed, Robert Royston did a very informal plan that John, in a wonderful essay called For an Urban Park in an Urban Situation, wrote of it looking like a miniature golf course. And so he proposed, kind of behind the scenes, a more formal approach to the park that would be large trees that would form a kind of arboreal hedge of formality against the sort of chaos of the ever-changing skyline of the city. And ultimately, these ideas were taken up in Waterfront Park, and we have the wonderful allays of trees that we see today. I want to read you something. He said this was his argument for this approach, because everybody was thinking about it. The PDC was overseeing the project, and they were having all kinds of meetings about what people wanted in the park, and they wanted horseshoe pits and barbecue stands and all of that. And John's argument was the park will be seen, and it will be seen daily by vastly more people than the number who set foot in it. It will be seen by the users of the East Bank freeways coming toward the city, or leaving it from the north and the east and the south, and it will be seen across a broad expanse of water, which opens the view so wide that almost the whole park is encompassed in it. And he sort of added that these contemporary ideas for park design were fine, but there's nothing so daring as orthodoxy. He even took up the cause of this building when the park was being put in. The PDC, the city now owned this building. It was originally a Chamber of Commerce sort of visitor center. And the city now owned it, and they wanted to turn it into a restaurant. And John actually very eloquently argued for it being torn down, both because the architectural idea could not serve a restaurant, really, in his mind. And then also, he was really strongly against commercial uses in a public park. He described it as potentially the camel's nose under the tent of just subverting the publicness of the park. He wasn't successful. It had already been made a local landmark, and ultimately it became McCall's Restaurant and now the Rose Building. a few of us got together when Commissioner Randy Leonard wanted to remodel it, and actually got Randy to agree to put it on the historic register and to do a minor amount of restoration of it. Some days I kind of feel, I think about it, John Yeon sort of turning in his grave, that we're actually trying to restore his building that he wanted torn down. He also played an important role in preserving Temple Beth Israel. In the early 80s, Rabbi Rose wanted to do an addition on this building, and John went to its defense. A masterpiece has been defined as a work of art wherein any alteration, addition, or subtraction would damage its supremacy. I'm sorry, late 80s. He wrote in a 1990 letter, "The temple is such a building." And ultimately, he prevailed by going over Rabbi Rose's head to the people who were funding it, the Schnitzers, and who prevailed on Rabbi Rose to put the building across the street. So this last section of this talk I want to call the craft of conservation, because that's not a word that you typically hear in conservation circles, or much in any kind of design circles, unfortunately, these days. But particularly in conservation, it's never been part of the dialogue, really. As John described it, I was, suppose, what would now be called an environmental activist, though not of the beautifully bearded sort. This is the area around Chapman Point in the late 40s, early 50s. Due to some road building and other developments, the crust on the sand had been loosened, and the sand piled up every year and had to be actually carted out by truck. Otherwise, it would bury the few little houses that were along there. And after buying Chapman Point, John gradually assembled more properties along there in a kind of patchwork, and ultimately ended up with about a half a mile of the Oregon coast. And he and some folks went out there and began trying to stabilize these sands. And they planted, and ultimately turned it into this. Thus the view that you have today. It was very complicated how the property ultimately came into public hands, and I won't bore you with all the legal ins and outs of that, but John's primary aim was to preserve that view corridor and Chapman Point undeveloped. And he described it as the predominant public value of Chapman Point is as an ornament in the landscape. So it takes you back to like the idea of that door handle, but at the same time, the scale of thinking about the landscape. In 1965, he bought this little stretch of land, which is directly across the Columbia River from Multnomah Falls. It was unzoned and had been put out to market as an industrial site. And this is kind of what it looked like. It was an old farmstead that had been washed away by the Vanport flood, what we call the Vanport flood, which flooded the whole Columbia watershed. And this is what he found there. And gradually, and the thing is, he bought it to preserve it, but he had an idea right out of the gate. He bought it in '65, and by '66, he was already working on this. And he essentially kind of sculpted it, both edited it and sculpted it. He created this amphitheatrical berm, but it's torqued. It's almost like an early earthwork, even though it is about 10 years before Smithson and those characters started doing that kind of work. But this directly faces the falls. Some of you have probably been out there, and ultimately created this viewing station, in a sense, for the falls. He rerouted a creek and created all of these places where you could get these captured vistas of the falls. It's kind of in the English picturesque tradition, but John's idea of a folly was very different than the English picturesque, where they would like put a fake ruin at some terminal vista. Here's a terminal vista of some blue hydrangeas, which of course are not native. And then these keyhole vistas of the falls. There it is from the air in the late 90s. Now this was primarily, his kind of picnic ground, private picnic ground, but it was also his recruiting ground. He had continued to advocate for the Columbia River Gorge throughout his life, and was keenly getting worried about it. When I-205, the Glen Jackson Bridge, was proposed, John was deeply worried about exurban sprawl on the north side of the Columbia, which he described as the orphan child that Washington has abandoned and Oregon can't adopt. Some other views of it. And he ultimately recruited this person. This is Nancy Russell. And John was, in a sense, he came from the day of money speaking to power, power to power, and with multiple counties and jurisdictions and 2 states, his efforts to preserve the gorge he was kind of flailing, and he didn't know quite what to do. But for some reason, he saw a light in this woman, Nancy Russell, who at the time was not political and not an advocate or anything. She had created a wonderful trails guide to the Columbia Gorge, and she did these slideshows of photographs of the flora. And somehow he saw this light in her, and they instantly got to work. She held a picnic at the gorge, at the Shire, to recruit members of the Portland Garden Club, a very formidable group of people, it turned out, and other folks. And they went to work, and boy, I'll tell you, not a moment's short. I'll give you a sense of what was going on, and I want to point out that this tale that I'm going to give you, the very short version, is really beautifully detailed in one of the books that we did by Bowen Blair, the founding director of the Friends of the Columbia Gorge, which Nancy founded. But this is Rimview Estates, or it was proposed as Rimview Estates, and this is on top of Cape Horn. It was going to be subdivided into 16 lots. One of the most prominent view sheds from Vista House. This is Steigerwald Park as we know it today, but at this time, in the late 70s, the Washington Department of Natural Resources had approved clear-cutting approximately 1,200-year-old cottonwood trees. And then just upstream from the Shire was this proposal, a subdivision called Hidden Harbor, that would have transformed almost a mile of the natural shoreline into 83 lots and a marina and an airstrip. So all this was going on. And Nancy and John went to work with the Trust for Public Lands and ultimately kind of turned the corner, not only just, and keep in mind, this is what was the sentiment on the north side of the gorge. I mean, you see these billboards. There's still actually one that's still there, gradually getting covered up with foliage. But it was a brutal battle. I mean, threats and all kinds of terrible things going on. But ultimately, in this rather long and kind of perils of Pauline path to fruition, the gorge legislation was ultimately passed. And again, I encourage you to read the long form of this in Bowen Blair's essay in this book, because I had no idea until I saw this essay of how close things were happening to being kind of cataclysmic on the north side of the Columbia Gorge. And Reagan legendarily signed the legislation holding his nose with one hand, as they said. But just to give you a sense of John's kind of recruiting skills, and also this idea of scale of his thinking, the multiple scales of his thinking, I want to tell you about the picnic that he had to recruit Nancy Russell, who he did not know at the time. He cold called her and Bruce, her husband, and invited them out to the Shire. And of course, John was well known, and there's kind of a mystique about him, but they didn't know him. And mysteriously, he canceled at the last minute, and then so they teed up another date, and he canceled that one at the last minute. And finally, they were kind of, what's going on? We don't really understand this guy. And Nancy told me about this shortly before she died. And ultimately, finally, a picnic happened. And John would, serve a picnic, from the kitchen garden that was kept on the Shire site, and roll out these Oriental rugs and serve it on a folding, Chinese table. It was really quite a production. and talked about his history in the gorge and what was going on, and then kind of the closing argument was made when a full moon rose. And so she was in as a result of this. And so there's not only a sense of the scale of this endeavor, but the performance of it. Bowen Blair beautifully describes in his essay that the Shire deserves its place in the pantheon of eminent properties recognized for the transformational movements they inspire. Places like Thoreau's Walden Pond and Pelican Island, where Teddy Roosevelt established the National Wildlife Refuge System and where the National Audubon Society was founded. And so with that, I'm really happy to take questions. I really thank you for taking time out of this beautiful day to hear some of these tales. And anybody have a question?
The location of the one outside of Oregon, where was that house?
Oh, it's a little town called Indianola. Yeah, it's kind of near Fort Bragg. Yeah.
Randy, what was his reaction to the freeways as they tore through the city of Portland and everywhere else in the 60s?
That I couldn't really tell you. I haven't seen anything about that. He, of course, wrote numerous letters and personally lobbied as the Columbia Gorge Highway turned into Highway 30, turned into I-84. Many of the curves that we continue to enjoy, both from the road and from the high vistas, are a result of his relentless lobbying on this idea of curves. But I've never seen any letters about the freeways carving up the city. He was active in other debates in the city. There's some eloquent testimony about, as early as the establishment of Council Crest Park, Waterfront Park. He was, involved in, arguing for what it might be as early as the 1930s, and then ultimately in the 70s when it was built. But yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. I'm curious how John Yeon's effort to preserve Chapman Point, that one section of the coast and the Ecola State Park, played into Tom McCall's later efforts, and successfully, obviously, to preserve the entire Oregon coast as public access land.
Well, I think he had kind of a complicated relationship with that, and I remember reading some letters about that, because I think that he and McCall were not always in alignment. John was not against private ownership of things, but I don't remember them well enough to tell you in great detail about them. Interestingly enough, he was not super supportive of the Oregon land use system. And felt that it was sort of overriding, private concerns. I've seen letters to that effect. He declined to become a founding member of the Thousand Friends of Oregon. And so he had oftentimes kind of surprising views, of certain issues as we look at them today as being kind of gospel. But I can't tell you specifics about that. I don't want to try to remember them. I don't remember them well enough.
I have a question about some of his old designs. If a developer today wanted to take his affordable housing designs and build them, or one of the unbuilt houses that he had designed and the client never went forward, are those things available? Who owns them? Is there access to those designs?
Well, I mean, they're in the University of Oregon archive, and I don't, I suppose you could do it. I mean, they were often designed for very specific sites, but you could probably adapt it if you wanted to do it. There's no copyright around any of that. Yeah, if one wanted to do one, I suppose you could. I mean, I think that, the affordable designs, the little plywood houses are kind of brilliant, for their era, but they're, we have very different, building systems and, mechanical systems today that I don't know how well they would necessarily hold up for what we need today.
I've heard you mention before a capital campaign for the Watzek House roof. Is that underway now?
Yeah, it is. Thanks for bringing that up. The Watzek House, again, our only National Historic Landmark house, is in need of a roof. And kind of badly in need of one. I think we'll be able to get through one more winter. And the reasons for that, I won't bore you with the details. Anybody wants to geek out on the roof, I can talk a lot about it. But it also needs new copper gutters, and in a sense it needs a whole kind of new lid. And because it's such a defining characteristic of the house, we're really trying to reproduce it as faithfully as we can while adding a couple of innovations that might help it work a little bit better for the long term. But it's a very, very high number that I won't even shock you with, because it's sort of, it's shockingly high unless you really know construction. But we are about, well, Doug Macy, the prominent landscape architect, stepped up with a $50K gift. We have probably another 150 in soft pledges. The 5-house tour that we're doing will go toward that. So we're inching closer to it. And so hopefully we will be able to assemble the money, and the university will be able to assemble the money for next year. That's the plan, is to come hell or high water to re-roof the house, because it really needs to be done.
We just found out in the Oregonian yesterday about the proposed toll road. It tells me that the appropriateness of this entire event, your lecture, and the show, can we get involved in decisions about that?
Oh boy, that's a really different topic. What I know of the current proposal before the legislature is not enough to really fairly comment. I have some very good friends who are really deep in the weeds on this, who oppose the whole bill because they believe expansion of the current freeway system is ridiculous, and that we should be investing in alternative forms of transportation. But I think, bottom line is somehow we have to figure out how to pay for whatever expansion of the road system we need. Toll roads, congestion pricing, I mean, all those things are going to have to be on the table, because I don't think we can look to Washington, D.C. for our solutions anymore. So we're going to have to, fund a lot of this on our own. So it's going to mean some hard choices.
I noticed on the Watzek House blueprints that one room was labeled library. And I just wondered if John had a personal library and what happened to it, and if he was largely self-taught, what was his educational background?
Well, as he described it, he got his education in Herman Brookman's library. He did some night classes at Columbia University during a brief stint in New York, but he was largely self-taught. The Watzek Library, of course, it was Watzek's house originally. John purchased it from the estate in the early 70s after Aubrey Watzek's death, and the books that are there today you can thumb through are a mixture of John Yeon's and Richard Lewis Brown, who lived there for many years. To my knowledge, there is no sort of John Yeon library per se. But I think he absorbed information from a lot of different quarters. I mean, as much from books as table legs.
Is there one final question?
Any final question?
Okay. Well,
Hey,
thank you,
thanks
Randy.
everybody. Go out and enjoy the day.